What's up guys, I'm Jordan Needham, this is Jham 3D, and today I'm going to be showing you how you can make these sick Batman logo wallpapers. Now to start off, of course, you're gonna need a Batman logo, or the bat symbol as they may call it. So there's obviously a ton of different Batman symbols out there, so it's up to you which one you wanna pick. As you can see, I kinda picked 3 different ones, and that was just to have some fun experimenting, so feel free to do that as well. But since it's 2022 and we just got a new Batman, which was freaking awesome by the way.
I'm vengeance.
Very inspiring. After watching that, I came home and I was like, I gotta do something Batman. And I'm not even a huge Batman fan, but I watched that and I was like, we gotta do something. So I immediately started with the new Batman symbol. Now this Batman logo may be one of the trickiest of the bunch because it's a little bit more abstract than some of their other ones. So regardless of which Batman logo you choose, there are still a few different ways, quite a bit of different ways to do this inside of Blender and model that logo. First of all, you can look for a model on like Sketchfab or using Blend Kit, which is a great add-on I highly recommend. But I found those were few and far between, and if I could find one, it wasn't really what I wanted. So to get really something specific, as usual, you may just have to do it yourself. So another way that you can do this is you can download an SVG file of your Batman logo, and then you can import that SVG file inside of Blender as long as you have the built-in SVG add-on, which is Scalable Vector Graphics 1.1 format. This will allow you to import and export SVG files. Now, if you do try this method, it's gonna be a bit of a mess. Usually once you convert your file to a mesh, the topology is very screwed up because it doesn't really know how to do it. So you may have to try a few different times to get at least reasonable topology. But from my experience, it kind of just does the same thing every time. But keep in mind the topology doesn't have to be perfect. So as long as you can get close and make it good enough to where a bevel modifier and a subdivision surface modifier will work well on it, I think that's pretty good. As you can see, my models were definitely not perfect, but towards the end, I definitely cleaned some of them up a little bit just to make sure that they worked well with subdivision surface. And if you don't fix your topology early on, it could cause a ton of headaches if you're just trying to clean something up. You know, adding edge loops is always something that I like to have in my arsenal. I love to be able to do that and quickly do it too. So I highly recommend that you do set up good topology. One thing that I found helpful when I imported the SVG file is using that SVG as a boolean to cut out a bat symbol in the cube. So I subdivided the cube a few times to make sure there was enough geometry, and it made it a lot more even. Additionally, the way that this particular Batman symbol was set up, the bat was actually negative space, so it wasn't actually an object, and I found that a quick way that I could convert that into an actual object inside of Blender was to use the yellow cutout as a boolean and then cut out the bat symbol out of a cube. Then I applied the boolean modifier and deleted every vertice that I didn't need on that cube, recentered the origin, and it actually worked pretty well. Now, it wasn't perfect topology, but I found it easy enough to work with, and it didn't really cause any problems. So those are 2 ways that you could get the logo, and then a third way is to reference model it by hand. What I did for this is I imported a image of the bat symbol that I wanted, and I tried to get it in a perfect front view. Now, my image wasn't quite that, but it was close enough for me to be able to work with so that I can mirror on both sides and it'll look perfectly fine. So you want to make sure that when you import your image that it is imported as a reference image, not a background image or as a plane. Because if you can import it as a reference image, obviously that is what Blender made it for. And so it's really easy to play around with the opacity of it. And then you don't really have to worry about, you know, making some finicky changes to the plane just so you can see. It just makes it way easier because you can see everything going on. Ooh. And a way that I love to start reference modeling like this is I actually enabled the Add Mesh Extra Objects add-on, which is a built-in Blender add-on. And you can just Shift A, go to Mesh, and you can add a single vert. vert. Once you add that single vert, you can then build, you know, trace your image around, and don't be too precise the first time around, but, you know, get it relatively close. Keep in mind, we're probably going to use modifiers. I'm assuming you are. And so you can kind of shape everything out closer. As soon as you get your subdivision surface, bevel modifier, and probably an edge split modifier on there, it's going to change things up a little bit anyways. So I would focus on just making sure you can get reasonably good topology, making sure everything is a quad, and avoiding n-gons as much as possible. And try to evenly space out your topology. But again, I know these are really weird shapes, so it can be quite a puzzle to do that. And you might not want to spend too much time doing that. But you can see on the third logo that I did, I definitely spent more time on that. And it was pretty satisfying because it just looked a lot nicer and it was way easier to work with. The reference image I was using was of the logo on the bat suit. So there was a lot more going on rather than just a simplistic, you know, black silhouette cutout. But I thought they looked pretty cool, and I thought that I'd give it a try, just experimenting with what that would look like. And I'm not the best at hard surface modeling, but I did find that some of these additions worked pretty well. You can see the objects, which kind of look like an eye on the bat now, the grate kind of object. That was really fun to make. I basically just made a cube, shaped it up to that similar size, added a cylinder, arrayed it a few times to match the holes. Then I used that as a boolean on that cube, and then applied the boolean, and it made those nice cuts. You might have to do this a few times, play around with the topology to make sure that it cuts out in a fairly reasonable fashion. I also added a few more cutouts around the logo using a very similar method and boolean modifiers and such. And then also I found what was really adding a nice touch to everything were those kind of nuts and bolts and screws all over Batman's suit. And I thought that that adds a nice, like, kind of edgy feel to it, a metallic sort of grunge feel or something. So quick tip, there's a really quick way to make bolts inside of Blender. You can just use the built-in add-on called Bolt Factory, and then you can just add in bolts as you would add in any other mesh. And it's a really fun add-on to experiment with, and it makes for really good bolts. You don't have to worry about any of the crazy stuff. Most of it's all covered within the options of that add-on. But you can see for the other logos, I kept it pretty simple, just modeling the outline of it and adding a few modifiers, and I was pretty much done. One final method I'll mention on how you could build your logo inside of Blender. It's definitely a less common way to do this, and probably not the quote-unquote correct way to do it, but you can even draw it, you know, using a tablet and a pen, and that could give a unique kind of feel and taste on the Batman logo if you want to kind of give your own spin on it, and maybe you're really good at drawing, and you can actually do that in draw mode. And so I just thought I'd mention that just in case you're like really good at drawing or you want to have fun doing that. Definitely worth giving a shot. So once you have a good model of your logo, the next thing that I found helpful is applying a few different modifiers. One of those was edge split, another one was subdivision surface, and the other was bevel. However, I did not use all three of these across the board for each of my logo variations, and you don't really have to. It just depends on the look you're going for and also the topology that was generated during your modeling phase. So the next step is texturing your logo. Now, as always, there's a few different ways you can do this. You could, of course, just download a material using like textures.com. You could purchase some. I think Ducky 3D has a lot of really good procedural metal textures. I personally don't have them, but I think they would look really well on this. And you can also use the Blend Kit add-on to search through some of those, which I find very useful and a huge time saver. Or if you're like me and you just want to have some fun and maybe waste some time, maybe you just like problem solving a little bit. I kind of like that. It feels like a puzzle sometimes. I designed my own metallic texture, and I have applied it to all of these different logos. I'll leave it up on the screen here so you can take a screenshot and work with it yourself. I don't want to spend too much time explaining this, but basically I made a simple metallic shader. I made sure that it looked very similar to a black metal, and then I added a whole bunch of different procedural textures, which I then plugged into bump nodes to add surface imperfections and scratches to it. After that, I mixed two different shades of metal using one of those noise textures plugged into a color ramp as a factor of the mix shader, so that it would add a different shade to the dents and scratches on the logo, which again, there's a very good Ducky 3D tutorial where he teaches you how to do that. Now, if you look at my shader, it got pretty complicated and it even was a little annoying for me to deal with, but I found it worked really well, and it was pretty procedural too. So there's a lot of options that you can change, and that's what I really love about building your own material inside of Blender, is that you have all these different options, and if you really understand how to do it, you should have no fear of just playing around with everything a little bit more and making sure you get exactly what you want. But But of course, sometimes the quickest thing and the best option is just downloading a texture, and I do that all the time. But the toughest part about that is, especially in an instance like this, it was really nice that I didn't have to UV unwrap anything. I just used a procedural texture. Okay, so now we have this logo. It looks really cool, but what are we gonna do with it? Well, of course, we need an environment to surround it. The first thing I did was just make a plane, placed it behind the Batman logo, and scaled it up so that it would give it enough cushion around the camera so you could move it if you needed to. Which reminds me, it's a great time to tell you that you should probably place your camera, if you have not yet, and using that nice depth of field, select your logo to make sure that it blurs around everything else in the scene and focuses on your logo. And this is not necessary, but I think it adds a nice effect, and especially when you're doing things that are more graphic design oriented with a 3D software, I think it's very nice to focus on really simple things because they add up over time. So if you get like the colors wrong, for instance, or you get the camera blur wrong, those are two things that could have added to it, but instead they're taking away. So graphic design in particular is something that might be really helpful to study when it goes into making something like this. The point here being that the more simple your design is, the more each and every small decision counts. So one mistake is very apparent, whereas if you have a complex scene, it can get hidden. So after you have your camera set up and your background scaled up, now we're gonna wanna add a texture to that background. Now I just used that blend kit add-on and searched up like grunge, I can't remember exactly what I searched up, it was like grunge metal texture, and just placed it on that background plane and it worked pretty well. Coincidentally, I was just trying to make a metallic background, but coincidentally it kind of, after time, I realized it sort of looked like a cave. So we accidentally and then intentionally created a Batcave sort of feel, which I felt was really cool. And you can change the colors and everything to make sure it's to your liking. But I thought the metallic look with the red and everything made it kind of look like blood, or really just like kind of gave eerie horror vibes to it. It really has a nice punch, a nice edge to it. So I kept the metallic look, but of course, if you're trying to make an accurate Batcave, you might want to look for something that's not metallic. Now you'll notice that I used two different backgrounds. The first background that we just talked about was found in Blend Kit as a procedural steel grunge texture, and the other one that we used was one that I created in a previous tutorial where I showed you how to make procedural steel shaders. And now is probably a great time to start thinking about how you're gonna light this scene. And I highly recommend picking something and sticking to it if you really wanna save time. Because I made the mistake, and this is something that all creatives do, I found that there was a lot of different lighting setups that looked really cool. And by the way, if you wanna learn more about lighting in general, or portrait lighting in particular, I recently posted a video where I talk about 8 different essential lighting setups to help you get a basic understanding of how to light your scenes within Blender. So it's really helpful, and I kind of use it as a great template. And you can also subscribe to me on Patreon to download the project file to that and use it as a great reference. That will really take your lighting to the next level and really help you in the decision-making process. What I found was really cool was actually using backlighting. So you just place a rim light behind the logo and it creates this sort of silhouette look. But I modeled so much on the front, you know, I didn't want to just leave it like that, because I spent all this time hard surface modeling on something, adding these textures and everything that it doesn't show it. And so in an effort to display all the other features of the logo, I definitely went with something other than just the silhouette backlighting. Now, since the Batcave, I placed a fairly soft and large light above the logo, so it would look like as if the sky was projecting light into a cave. I also played around by duplicating that light, flipping it around 180 degrees and placing it underneath the logo, and dimmed it to make it less powerful than the skylight above, as if it was like something hellish to give it some horror vibes, and it gives that nice contrast of good and evil. Now I know this might start to get confusing because I made so many different variations, so please forgive me. But another light that I used was a pretty harsh light, which I placed directly in front of the logo, and it came really in handy for the Batman 2022 version of the logo so that I could illuminate those eyes or those metal grates. But I kind of think the backlighting looked the coolest. Now, once you get a good setup to light your logo, now is probably the time to start thinking about the colors that you're going to be using in the scene. It's Batman. It's Batman 2022, and they already did this for you. This is the good part about making a Batman tutorial and a Batman project, is that a lot of other creative people already did the work for you. You don't have to think about the logo color. You don't have to think about that. They got that covered. And so you can just use the themes of a particular Batman film or animated series or comic book or whatever that inspired you and kind of use that color palette. I went with a classic sort of cinematic feel. So I actually tinted most of my lights slightly blue, and I kept the rest of them, I think, just completely unsaturated and just a white light, because my background was really metallic and it had some different shades in there, so it came out as red. But I did make the rim light of the bat symbol a really saturated red, and I also experimented using a blue color like the Dark Knight did. So given this was Batman 2022 and red seems to be the theme, I stuck with that red rim light and I made sure that there was plenty of red within my scene. And now, since you set up the lighting, I think it's a good time to start thinking about adding some depth to your scene. And there's a few ways you can do this. We already did this if you followed the step of adding a blur to your camera, implying to the eye this is a 3D space and there is distance between the objects. Now, in order to get that blur to look even better, one of the things that's really nice is to add a foreground object. And I figured that since this is a Batcave, what we're gonna do is add in a swarm of bats using geometry nodes. So what I did is I just searched for a bat model on Sketchfab. I ended up downloading this one. Link is in the description below. Credit to the creator of that. And basically, I just used this bat as an instance, created a geometry node on the background plane. I used a total of maybe 5 or 6 nodes to set up the geometry nodes. And on the screen is the setup that I used to make these bats. And basically, I just instance the bats and then randomize the offset and the position of those bats so that they would be kind of all over the place. Also randomize the rotation and scale of these bats just a little bit using random value nodes. It's a very simple setup, and if you followed my recent tutorial about making roses and rain with geometry nodes, this should be a very familiar and simple setup for you. Now, in a material preview, because it's kind of difficult to see using a render view, you can play around with the seed of your geometry nodes and making sure that you are in the camera view and you can see which objects are being blurred. Keep in mind, the whole thing is we're trying to get distance and we're trying to get depth of field. So I think it's good to make sure that there's a few that are pretty close to the camera and blur those out quite a bit. One thing that you might also do is just find a random distribution of those bats that you like, and if you want to add a few more, you can just Alt-D to duplicate the instanced bat, so the original bat that we had, and place it wherever you want, rotate it in the way that you want, and that works very well. And since we're on the topic of bats, one other thing that I did is I used a very similar geometry node setup on the bat logo, and I basically just offset it and scaled it up just a little bit so it looked like bats were kind of perching, if that's the word, on the bat symbol. And you can see that around the edges of the silhouette, it looks pretty nice. On the more lit scenes, fire. On the brighter scenes that had a lot more front-facing light, the bats did not show up. My reasoning behind that was when you shine a light on a bat, it typically flies away, so you wouldn't see that many. One thing I also did too was I changed the material of that bat to fit the scene a little bit better, and I also added an emission shader onto the eyes because I thought it'd be kind of cool to see their glowing eyes. So the third thing that we can do for adding depth to the scene is adding some mist. You can do this in 2 different ways. You can either add a holy shit, by adding a volume shader to your scene, but this is of course going to slow down your render. And guys, I rendered like 54 different images of this scene, different variations, you know. I would have not been able to do that if I had the volume shader, so definitely something to keep in mind. But if you got a look that you really want and you want to stick with that, you can use the volume shader, or you can just use the mist option inside of Blender. Just make sure you check that box in your render output and play with the distance in your world settings. Okay, now we're pretty much ready to go. So just hit render out that image, and you might want to start with a lower sample, lower resolution than your final output, because we're going to be taking visual cues and we're going to be changing things as we go. But I always like to start with a lower res, lower sample count, quick render before I finalize everything, just in case I have to render it again. So in the compositing side of things, I actually didn't do too much work inside of Blender besides just adding the mist by just using a mix RGB node, setting it to add, and mixing that mist all over the scene. A few recommendations I have if you're gonna do color grading with inside of Blender is probably playing with the contrast of your scene, also using a color balance node to kind of get the colors that you want. And like I said, because I was going for a cinematic look, I tinted the shadows blue. But I actually do the majority of my color grading inside of Lightroom. So what I kind of use Blender compositing for is color correction rather than color grading. And so I make sure that everything looks good and is up to par with what I want before I export it into Lightroom. And that is actually what's called color grading, is making sure that your shadows, your midtones, and highlights are all in a place that are manageable and easy to work around, and you have enough data to kind of play around with before you color grade it. Because when you're color grading something, if your whites are blown out, you can't do much, and if your blacks are crushed, you can't do much either. So it's just keeping a good range of color within that image before I exported it to Lightroom. I will probably make a tutorial in the future about how I do my color grading with inside of Lightroom and how you could implement this workflow to your process as well. But I realize it might be frustrating that I use Lightroom because it's not a free software. That bothers a lot of people because, you know, Blender is free, and so a lot of the viewers that watch these sorts of things are expecting everything to be free, and I understand that. Just know that most everything that you can do in Lightroom, you can do inside of Blender. It's just not the best for color grading or compositing. In my experience, in my opinion, it's not as user friendly. I personally don't like using Blender for color grading, but I've seen some people do some really crazy things with this. So don't feel discouraged that, hey, you know, this guy used Lightroom. I'm sure you can figure it out inside of Blender as well. And I also didn't do, with this scene, I didn't do anything crazy with color grading, mainly just exposure, contrast, and tinting of shadows and highlights just a little bit. That's basically all doable within inside of Blender really easily. I could have kept this one inside of Blender, but I didn't. So once you're happy with the way that this looks, you can go ahead and start up-resing your render, higher sample count, and keep your max light bounces between 10 and 12. It's typically what I do, and I didn't need any volume or transmission or any of that. And make your resolution a 4K resolution. So what is that? 3840 by 2160? I always mess this up. 3840 by 2160, I think, is the resolution that I went for. 4K, and it turned out pretty good. So it should be really fast. There's not a lot going on in this scene. Now, if you wanted to get really crazy, you could animate this, which is something that I did play around with a little bit. And I basically just parented my camera to a circle and rotated that circle around the logo. You can also animate the camera blur so that when it gets in front, it blurs around the logo a little bit more and focuses on that. And I made it loop as well. So I didn't render this out, but I just wanted to show you what you can do. It's very easy to animate once you did this. And because every aspect of this scene is fairly simple, it's a very quick animation. It should be computationally easy on your computer. So I highly recommend at least having some fun and playing around with that. Anytime I get any sort of support, I really highly appreciate it. And if you want to support even more, I do have a Patreon. Link is in the description below. In this Patreon, I'm going to try to include the project file of this, but I'm not sure that I will be able to since it is trademarked material. But if you want access to project files, or you just want to support me and support this channel, please consider subscribing to me on Patreon. And so let me know in the comments below, what is your favorite Marvel or DC character? Personally, for me, Spider-Man has always been my favorite Marvel character, but this Moon Knight show is shaping up to look pretty cool, so we'll have to see. So let me know your favorite superhero in the comments below, and I might, just might, make some fan art for you. So stick around, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss it. As always, I'm your boy, Jordan Edom, and I will catch you guys next time. Peace.